I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I must say it's been interesting these last few weeks to see the level of interest and activity around this legislation. It has sat for some time. The Select Committee reported back from memory in about May last year, and it has said there was an election intervened, of course, but it has sat relatively unmolested for some time. But of late there has been some obvious interest, and particularly industry interest in the industry seems to be going to some pains to ensure that we as politicians are well informed. And I think I have to acknowledge the Minister's comments in her introduction that the larger companies, the Googles, the Facebook and the like, who will be affected by this legislation, are not actually public service organisations. They exist to make money, to make a profit. It's interesting that the Productivity Commission noted that regulation does impose compliance cost on some of these digitally based organisations, and frankly I'm quite happy for that to occur. Generally I'm not an enthusiast for imposing cost on business, but if a small cost on business generates a positive social benefit, particularly when large multinational organisations are involved, then frankly I have no concern with that. I was on a select committee for this bill. It was a good select committee. It was a very engaged select committee. The bill that came out was notably different from the bill that went in, and it was a better bill. It was a very engaged, a very vigorous conversation. And I think, as I say, that the bill that came through was better and much improved. Having said that, I'm quite sure that this bill is imperfect. Seldom, I think, do we get it absolutely right the first time when legislation goes through this House. But I do believe that this bill is sufficiently good, fit for purpose, to merit our support, and the Greens will continue to support it. We are interested to see the SOP, which we understand will be forthcoming, and we will engage in that in later readings, obviously. So I'd just like to refer specifically to some of the objections we've heard. And we've heard a bit about this notion that this bill will criminalise children. We have an age of criminal responsibility in New Zealand of 14. That doesn't change. I have not seen any appetite from any stakeholder in this conversation to criminalise children. Clearly it's a theoretical possibility, but it would have to be extremely high-end offending and continued offending before I think any child would suffer the penalty from a court. There's been commentary about education or lack of it, and I can say that one of the first changes the Select Committee effected was in the clause 3, the purpose clause of the bill. Right there at the nub of the bill, inserted the words deter and prevent as well as mitigate harm. And the conversation about that was absolutely to do with the necessity of educating. Of the best cure, of course, is prevention. And that the new wording of the clause, the purpose clause, reflects that commitment to doing that. And I must confess I'm slightly puzzled by the objection that there's nothing in the legislation that indicates where the educative activity will come from. To me it's blindingly obvious, but one of the core functions, and it's written into the bill, that the approved agency will have at its core a responsibility to educate in the same way that the private sector is already doing, as is NetSafe and others. And I think Vodafone's worth a special mention. They have a very active educative program targeted well at kids, their parents, families, schools and the like. So I do think that objection has been somewhat overstated. So we've heard a bit about the fact that other countries are not going down this road of creating criminal offences. So I've done enough sort of comparative research around corrections, around policing, around justice issues generally, to realise you have to tread a bit cautiously, because inevitably legislative regimes are complex, multifaceted, and you really need to know and understand the breadth of a particular regime before I think it's useful to make comparisons between one and another. I'm somewhat persuaded by the fact that our police association has identified that there is a gap in the legislation. They're quite relaxed that if I go online and threaten to assault somebody, damage their property, do some criminal harm to them, then clearly that's an offence. There's no question with that. Low-level bullying, the sort of schoolyard thing, has always gone on, always will, and we have means of dealing with that. But this notion of causing harm through digital communication, the Police Association in their submission pointed to a gap in the legislation there that is impeding their ability. The appeal from them was, give us the tools and they will apply them appropriately. The Human Rights Commission made a similar commentary that there is a gap in the legislative toolkit and that offences or offending is not able to be addressed clearly and with a degree of timeliness, and that this new legislation is necessary and useful to provide to plug some of the gaps in that. So the point, I think, clause 9, of course, is the clause that creates this new offence of causing harm. And I think it's important to note that there are three characteristics of the offending that must be proven. The first is that must be a proven intention to cause harm. The second is that it must be proven that a reasonable ordinary person would suffer harm as a result of this. So it's a somewhat objective test. Is this something that crosses that threshold? The third is that actual harm did result from the digital communication. So intention is not enough. Potential is not enough. The three characteristics are conjunctive. You must prove intention and the likelihood of offence or harm being done and the actual harm being done. We've heard some comments about concerns that satire, for example, might be stifled by this legislation. Again, I don't accept that, because on section 19 again, it carries on to say, it talks about the context of a particular communication. If any one of us sees reporting on the civilian website, for example, and there was a case, I believe, where one Colin Craig was quoted on that website as having said something which, of course, he had not said. It is a satirical website. Any reasonable person reading such a website would be alert to the context in which that statement is made, and that, to me, would pull the teeth of any attempt to bring a criminal charge against such a person. The age and circumstance of the person who allegedly or is being offended against, at whom harm might be directed. And again, politicians, if somebody has a little bit of a crack at us on Facebook or such like, we're expected to have a thick skin. We're public figures. A mature adult, a person of some authority, is expected. The threshold would be significantly different for any one of us in this House than it would be for a 13-year-old school child, for example. And I think that's entirely appropriate. I do think that the qualifications, if you like, the extremity of language, age and characteristic of the victim, the context I've mentioned, anonymity, all of those things. I do think that there are protections already built into the bill that can assure us that that will not be misused or abused. As I said earlier, the Human Rights Commission came out strongly in support of this bill, and we've heard a bit about some concerns that we're creating offences in the digital environment that don't exist in the real world. And the HRC quoted a 2011 report to the UN General Assembly from a UN rapporteur who talked about the unique characteristics of the internet. It is a unique environment. It is not the real world. And I think we are slowly sort of reaching towards a legislative regime that recognises the uniqueness of that environment and seeks to address the inevitability, really, that it will be used inappropriately to cause harm to people, and that is something that this bill seeks to remedy. I'm also comforted by the fact that the bill specifically states in clause 6, it refers to anybody exercising functions and powers of the bill must be consistent with rights and freedoms contained in the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. And there are not too many pieces of legislation that specifically identify an obligation to be compliant with the Bill of Rights. And I do think that it's almost a belts and braces approach. I think it just recognises that we are feeling our way onto new territory here. And I don't think we need to resile from that. It is a new environment. It is a new set of situations that we're addressing. And I am comforted somewhat by that specific reference to the Bill of Rights Act. So I look forward to participating in the committee stage and the later debates on this bill. Thank you.